So let's get into a scenario. And if you can't give any legal advice or suggestions on it, by all means, say that you can't. But say, for instance, if a business is selling VoIP services and it's not registered with all of the federal and state agencies, what are potential ramifications to the seller? And then by extension, what are the potential ramifications to that VoIP seller's clients?
So I advise clients about risk. Managing risk is really one of the things that we're leaned upon to do quite regularly, because as I like to explain things, all of those laws and regulations that I described earlier, the state, local, federal, they don't, they're binary. Okay, so it's on, off, yes, no, comply, don't comply, lawful, unlawful. There are no written exemptions just because you're small, okay? Just because your revenue or tax or fee exposure is small. And I won't even use the word de minimis, because de minimis exemption is something that arises under the federal regulations and the Universal Service Fund. And if anybody ever wants to get into the detail of the pros and cons of the de minimis exemption, trust me, it has been more negative than positive, okay? We've even tried to get the FCC to make the de minimis exemption optional, because companies find it more convenient to contribute directly on their revenue, even if it's de minimis, because it's less disruptive for their customers. Well, you don't want to have a customer that's not getting a 15, 20, 25% tax because they're you're de minimis, and then suddenly, because you grew, you have to then start applying that to your customer's invoice in order to recoup the cost on the retail revenue. So, bill shock, there are a whole bunch of issues involved with the de minimis exemption. So getting back to the binary way that the laws and regulations are, you are either complying or you aren't. And to comply, there's a cost to compliance. It's not free. And I would say that if you want to comply on the cheap, you're going to get what you pay for. Because, again, that old adage about you get what you pay for, well, that applies in professional services as well. If you want something done well, you're going to work with somebody who does it well. And if they do it well, chances are they're going to charge a little bit more than the low man on the totem pole. So in any event, that high cost of compliance and that continued cost of compliance, because once you enter a market, you have the trifecta of governmental agencies that you may have to be registered before. So if you're transacting business in a new state outside of your home state, your domicile, where you're incorporated or where your primary business location is, you're going to have to register as a foreign corporation or foreign LLC with the Secretary of State. There's a cost to that. It can range anywhere from a couple $100s to do the professional service to register. And then the filing fee can be anywhere from $50 to over $2,000 in some limited jurisdictions. You then have the Department of Revenue for taxes, 911 fees. There's a professional fee cost, usually not a filing fee, but again, registering before that agency has a one-time cost. And then utility commissions for voice over IP companies. There are about 35 of them that require voice over IP companies to contribute to their state universal service funds or their TRS funds. That's for persons with certain disabilities. So again, there are registration requirements and costs there. So all of those one-time costs, I like to ballpark it between $600 on the lower end to over $1,500, $2,000 on the high end. That's a one-time cost. beyond that, once you're on the radar screen, once you've registered, that's not the end of the story, that's the beginning. You then have a continuing obligation to determine what taxes and fees are owed and remit, returns, the remittances, the fees, the taxes, whether it's monthly, quarterly, or annual, or sometimes sporadically all over the place. Those obligations have to be met. And so those are typically things that end up being outsourced for companies that have awareness that they are exposed in multiple jurisdictions across the US and not just an isolated single state, which is becoming rarer and rarer these days because of the mobility of employees, of workers, of offices, and just the mobility of voice over IP itself. So again, you've got those costs. And for a company that's just ramping up, where we're selling SIP trunks and hosted PBX services and reselling WebEx and this, that, and the other thing to their customer because they're shifting from premise-based solutions to cloud-based solutions, which opens up a world of opportunity. You want to continue selling those, but in doing it, you are exposing yourself potentially to this environment where your revenue may not justify the cost of compliance. And that's where the concept of risk management comes into play. And there's only so much you can do to manage risks. And again, any risk management entails non-compliance with legal obligations. And as a lawyer, I could never tell a client not to comply with a legal obligation or requirement. The best I can ever do is to tell a client what risks are involved and what the consequences would be. So it is a challenging environment in which to operate, which has given rise to, again, different ways of offering services and creative solutions. And I think we'll talk in a little bit about a business structure between supplier, vendor, and retailer and consumer that addresses some of those concerns, and one that I believe VoIP Doctors is quite familiar with.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. That was quite detailed. Before we get into that one model that you just touched on, I want to talk briefly about reselling and white labeling for a moment.